I know a lot of folks who say that their parent may have known when they were little, but they never told them. And because they were like, oh, as long as I don't tell them, right, they won't walk through life feeling like they're broken. I'm hoping that more and more parents find a way to navigate that in a different way, I'll say. Because, I mean, frankly, regardless of whether or not somebody gives you a label, your experience is still going to be your experience. You will still live with it.
Hello, welcome to Square Pegs Podcast.
In this podcast, we share first-hand experiences of neurodiverse graduate students and faculty members.
I'm your sometimes guest host, Lexi Hain.
And I'm the host, Arash Zaghi. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce Sheldon Gay, the host of I Must Be Buggin' podcast. Buggin', B-U-G-N, stands for Black, Underrepresented, Unidentified, Gifted, and Otherwise Neurodivergent. Sheldon created this platform for Black, gifted, and neurodivergent individuals to connect, share experiences, and celebrate their unique strengths. He's also a civil engineer with a tech-focused MBA. Today, we are diving deep into his experience. You won't want to miss it. Hello, Sheldon. It's very nice to have you on this podcast. Thank you very much for taking the time and accepting our invitation to join us today. I really appreciate that. And I was excited when I got to know you when you reached out to have this conversation, and I look forward to it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this opportunity for a while. I'm glad that we're even in position to have this conversation because, like you said, I heard you on a podcast and automatically was like, I need to meet this guy. So, since then we've had conversations and have really hit it off. So yeah, very, very much so looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. So maybe we can split kind of our time in two parts. One, we talk about your experiences growing up, going through school, and then like the work that you're doing, the advocacy work, the podcast that you have. So we will make sure that we spend enough time, we do justice to both. Then let's start with some of your childhood experiences. Let's talk about up until the age you finished middle school. Anything that stands out for you? Any memories that kind of was very clear, made it very clear for you that like the way you learn, the way you interact with people, the way you process information, communicate might be a little different. Things that kind of like differentiated you in your mind.
Yeah, so first of all, now as a 42-year-old Black man, as I reflect back on my childhood, there's a lot of interesting things that come up for me. I tell people now I kind of have two memories. I have my original set of memories around, my childhood, and now after kind of discovering my neurodivergence, it now helps me to see things with a second set of memories in a different way. And so probably the earliest memory that is very tangible is first grade. So I was born in Philly. My mom moved us down to the DC area. One of the main reasons is for, the education system. And so first grade, one of the things that I remember is basically, honestly, sleeping through it. And what I mean by that and why that's of interest is because it was, again, the first kind of formal interaction with a teacher where I stood out from the other students. So I remember waking up and the other students would be talking about whatever the topic of the day was. And I would be, bored, to be quite honest. The distinction there was my mom, she came to the school because I guess, the teacher was concerned and she just decided to show up one day. And she tells the story about how she came and just like watched. When they met afterwards and she was talking about, my interactions in class, and in her teacher's mind, I was someone who was just totally disengaged and not willing to participate and just a lot of very negative things. However, my mom was like, that doesn't sound like my son. And what ended up happening is at some point there was talk of me actually being skipped because I was sleeping in class because I wasn't feeling challenged. I was sleeping in class because it just wasn't in a really engaging environment for me. Yes, yeah, stimulating enough. As much as I was trying to fit in, the you could wake me up and tell, I can answer any of the questions, but it was a tough spot. And again, I think the key part of the story is there are a lot of folks for whom the education system may look at as, quote unquote problem children, but the reality is there's something more going on there. And that's why I really encourage folks to be curious about what's happening rather than kind of just taking things at face value. And so that was one of the first things that I can think about where instead of me potentially being moved into, kind of a problem child label, it was actually this thing where I'm thankful for my mom kind of speaking up and advocating for me, because then it was recognized that no, I needed more. If you go to the next grade, second grade, I went to a school that I absolutely adore. I will mention it by name because I do absolutely adore it. It's called Lowell School. It's in the DC area. I immediately got there and recognized this is like my kind of school. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the learning there is much more project based. It's also very much so focused on the individual learner and understanding how their needs need to be met. The teacher that stands out for me all the time when I think about Lowell is this Black woman. Her name's Teresa, and she taught math and science. And when I look around at like my family, I didn't know, like there wasn't a lot of people who were really interested in math and science, and they say it that way. But she kind of awakened that in me. When we learned science and when we learned math, it wasn't just out of a book. It wasn't just her at a chalkboard. She was giving us, I tell people about the story of the silkworm. So like instead of just learning about the life cycle of a silkworm, we had silkworms in the classroom. And so we watched a literal life cycle take place. We fed the silkworm. We took the silkworm home. And so this engaged me at a whole different level, because now it wasn't just, do you know what a larva is, right? It's, do you see what's happening in front of you? 2 days ago, it looked like this. Now it looks like something different. And it really sparked my mind.
So you changed completely. You were a different kid then.
Yeah. Now all of a sudden it was really interesting. It wasn't just memorization or anything like that. It was, let me come back to the class and tell you what I learned about silkworms and what I observed. Right. So now you're getting insight into my mind. And as I even say that, I get chills thinking about it, because that to me is like super, super exciting.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing a lot of similarity between the way I was at school and your experiences. So I want to kind of also for our listeners to form a better idea about what kind of kid you were and like how it informed your upbringing, your passion for this advocacy work. I mean, if it is rooted to kind of like that, those past experiences, if the stark contrast that you've seen, like how the environment can really change a person and the way they interact with the environment.
I can probably give one or two more examples. Still dealing with math. We were just learning maybe the very basics of exponents. One of the teachers, she said, hey, does anybody in this class know what the largest 4-digit number is? Lots of people were, she gave us a couple minutes, and then people were raising their hands like 99 times 99 or 999 times. Like everybody's trying to come up with their answer, and nobody was getting it. And so she's, ready to kind of tell us the answer. And in my mind, I got a thought, but I was like, I don't think you can do that. Like, I'm feeling like I'm making up a completely incorrect way of doing math. And so I'm doubting myself in my mind, but, I'm like, Sheldon, just go ahead and raise your hand. I kind of got the two little people on my shoulder, right? One's like, say something. One's like, don't. So anyway, I end up saying something, and I say, okay, let me try this. And she's like, okay, sure. I go up to the board and I write 9 to the 9th to the 9th to the 9th. I'm thinking I've just completely embarrassed myself in front of all of my friends. And the teacher is like, no, like, that's right. Like, how did you come up with that? There was no answer to that question, because it was just a concept that sort of manifested in my mind. Again, we hadn't really learned, at most we had learned what an exponent was, but not really how to use it.
Yeah. That's kind of like divergent thinking, the work we've been doing. I think it's called divergent thinking. I mean, skip thinking. I think they're the same, because what you're talking about is just completely thinking outside the box rather than putting the numbers in front of each other and 9,900 something. You're thinking literally outside the box of kind of one line and putting the numbers in exponents and trying to kind of
Yeah.
get the biggest number. And so that clearly shows that your mind worked a little different than maybe the next person, for sure. That's something that we frequently ignore. We've put so much focus on content when we do lectures that we completely forget or ignore the possibilities and opportunities that may be available to us, that we use that interaction time to enhance other skills of the student. When you think about that, traditional lectures are overly purified. They are just like the only thing that's left is just how to do this kind of mathematical operation. That's it. This is where you get the number. This is you put your next digit, and that's how you bring it. That's just like very mechanical. That's it, out of context. And
Hmm.
it might be something that kind of like students, some maybe more standard learners can gain mastery of. I mean, how to just like go through the process, and particularly like is a fellow chart of like, oh, do this first and then the next step is this and this, and so they can follow it. But for non-traditional learners, I mean, for me to be able to understand something, I needed to know what it is good for, what's the context.
Yeah. Yep.
So
Yep. 100%.
what's your experience?
Yeah. I mean, if I kind of took a time machine forward a little bit, the perfect example that's coming to mind is my freshman year at Drexel University. Drexel is a 5-year program with co-ops. And so for those that don't know, that basically meant for 6 months I was working full time. There was 3 co-ops that I did during my time there. But my first co-op, I was working on a building in the Philadelphia area that some of you may have visited since then. It's called the National Constitution Center. This was my first engineering job. I remember showing up on site, and again, I had my calculus, I had my basic physics, and I had all that stuff I brought to the table. But what I realized very quickly was that didn't help me read the engineering drawings. I had to learn that on site. And there were a lot of things I had to just learn about the way of putting a building together. And it really came to a head in the example that I'm thinking about, because I essentially became the concrete and steel inspector on site. And one day they brought steel in that wasn't the right size. So we had to think about what we were going to do, because we couldn't wait. The next time that we could get the appropriate size shipment was at least, I believe, 2 weeks out. And that would have thrown off the whole project timeline. And so this presented a perfect opportunity to say, okay, we have steel of a certain size. How do we actually take all of this knowledge and apply it to figure out how we use what we have, right? We kind of, for those old enough, we had to kind of MacGyver it, right? And so let's just say, for simplicity's sake, that the size that steel that we needed was with a, 3-inch diameter, and all we had was those with 1-inch diameters. We had to figure out the calculations for what we could do with the 1-inch diameters to be equivalent, if not stronger, within this building, and to keep the project going. And so for me, that's like a perfect example, because they don't teach you that in class. There's no what happens when you don't have what you need. It's very sequential about what you do. And so you did have to think outside the box and be a little bit more creative, and particularly with the time crunch, right? That, you had to figure out what to do on a building that like literal people will be in, right? And so that's the kind of learning that really excited me, because now, again, it wasn't just, can you tell me what this equation does? It's, okay, how are we going to apply this to these real things that are in front of us?
And how was your experience in general in Drexel, your undergrad experience?
To be honest, it was a little bit of a mixed bag, but mostly because I was learning myself. Freshman and sophomore year definitely felt much more, those were probably the tougher years, because it was much more like, this is the basis, just learn your physics, just learn your chemistry, just learn
Very
your,
abstract, probably. Right?
Yeah, right. Just very abstract, and you just kind of had to get those basics in. And so I was always thinking about, I was ready to get to the part where we got to like build something cool. After sophomore year, into your 3rd, 4th, 5th year, that's when you really got to start taking electives. That's when, now again, a lot of that stuff you were applying in either at co-op or, sometimes in class on real projects. And so the classes that stand out to me, not all of them are STEM, one of my favorite classes and most important classes that I ever took in my life is a class that was called Deviant Behavior. What I loved about that class was that it talked about the frameworks that we work under. There are things that we consider to be quote unquote deviant, let's say here in America, that if you go to France, if you go to Mexico, if you go to somewhere else and sit with some indigenous folks of that location, it's a completely different
Yeah.
perspective. It was like neurodivergence, but kind
Large
of like
scale. Yeah.
how divergence. Yeah, right. So like it was super interesting to me. It really affirmed a lot of the thoughts that I was having and how I thought. It was like the first class where I was like, wait, I'm allowed to think like this? Like I'm allowed to notice these things in particular, because I did spend a lot of my life noticing things that it was like, this doesn't make any sense, but everybody's doing it. So I guess maybe I'm the one who's,
Yeah.
kind of off.
So I think that based on what I'm hearing, that the co-op experience has been like an anchor for you to really engage you in the program. And I'm thinking, I mean, at UConn, we don't have a program like that. And the courses remain lecture based more. The first 2 years is like that. I think universally that's problematic. That's why the rate of dropout is so high for non-traditional learners in the I mean, I'm thinking, I mean, like, if we can figure out a way that we kind of bring that kind of like the real life meaning of what they're learning in the class earlier to the students, that might be a way to re-engage them and maybe excite them about things. Particularly, I'm talking about neurodiverse learners, non-traditional learners. So do you think that I mean, based on what I'm hearing, that played a role to keep you engaged, right?
Yeah, no, actually, that's one of the first times I've really thought about it in that way. I'll never forget being in a lecture and they say like, look to your left, look to your right,
Yeah.
and like you said, it was. I mean, literally, I think they said like 60% or something like that. Maybe it was even as high as 70% of those folks won't be here. And at the time, it's like, what one, you're like, I hope it's not me, but two, you're like, yeah, that sounds like a really high number. Like, you all seem like you can do this. But now that I think about it, I do wonder what percentage of those folks who switch out of engineering and maybe still go into technical things, because I know a lot of folks who switch out of engineering and went into like management information systems or went into IT or went into like so many different, like they were still staying technical,
Yeah.
but those things for them were, more tangible. And I'm sure, to be fair, the intensity wasn't as high, but I think there's something to be said for how do we, in these first couple of years, integrate more contextual experience around what we're learning, and then what would that do for our retention rates? Because I know that, as you said, particularly from a neurodivergent person's perspective, if that intensity is already, enough of a challenge, if you add in the fact that you're literally working against your mind and body to execute because it doesn't align with your type of thinking, it's not that you can't do it, right? It's just that you're not being provided an environment that's affirming of the way in which you approach a problem. And so I think it would be really, really good for folks to be finding ways to do that, particularly in those first few years.
Mm-hmm. What you said about looking to your right and looking to your left, I've heard that many contexts. Do you believe that there are people that they are proud of it? And it's really annoying when you think about that, because they think that's a cool thing, first of all, to say. Second is like they think that's the success of a system that can weed out,
Yeah.
I don't know, whomever is not in their mind qualified to stay in the program.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Mm-hmm.
their failure, honestly,
Mm-hmm.
because if a student got admitted to their program, to our program, I'm not talking about like a specific one. I think across the nation we see that problem. If the student doesn't succeed, it's either a problem with their admission, so their selection criteria is completely messed up, or they didn't have the talent and resources to retain the student. Imagine if companies say something like that. How ridiculous it sounds. For example, for their new hires, orientation day, they say, oh, look at you left, 70% of you will not be here after. Like, come on. I mean,
Yeah.
see how messed up kind of that notion is, and then the fact that the education system is proud of it, that
Yeah.
just speaks to the problem. I think that, like, okay, that if that is your mindset, that explains a lot of things, your attitude toward the design of these science math classes, so that the purpose is not for you to learn something, is just to challenge you to the breaking point in an unreasonable manner, so that you
Hmm.
snap, you leave, so. And I don't know what they're selecting for, honestly.
Hmm.
Based on what we are seeing in more advanced engineering classes, I think what get through that filter is more of like those that they are very comfortable to solve standard problems. Those
Hmm.
are the ones that they get past this filter
Hmm.
that they have put in place.
Hmm.
Because when I teach more advanced engineering courses, and everyone is like, first of all, comfortable with the curriculum. I mean, like,
Hmm.
they just take it as it is. They don't challenge it. They don't challenge our
Hmm.
methods. The second is they are very complacent. That it seems, I
Hmm.
mean, like those rebels, I mean, those people that they are there to challenge the status quo, to think outside the box, I mean, they disappear. And that's terrible for our science and engineering when you think about. Those are the exact minds that we need to make sure they make it.
Absolutely. I think, Arash, you just spoke to something amazing and beautiful. It reminds me, first of all, of one of my mentors, one of my friends, Mitch Swan, who is a fellow Drexel Mechanical Engineering graduate. He always reminds me of the question of like, who are we and what do we want? When we apply that to this, it's who are we as an institution and what do we want to be able to say about our graduates? And if what we're saying is we're admitting people, like you said, it's one or the other. Either you're letting in the wrong folks, right? Because you say, yes, we've admitted you. You can, matriculate. And then if you know very early on, you're going to tell them that the vast majority of them are not going to make it. Something's not right there.
Yeah.
And if you do believe that they have the skills and that rate remains the same, then you've also failed to say we want to be the type of place where we've got the support systems to keep these folks.
Yeah.
Because, to your last point about, particularly from an engineering perspective, I have a few friends who are fellow STEM graduates at various levels, through PhD level. And one of the things we all grapple with is it's not just enough to, for example, be able to build an AI system. It's really, really important to understand the implications of that system.
Holistic.
And right, holistic, right? And what kind of impact it's going to have on the community. You don't get to that level of thinking if you're just saying to yourself, it needs to have a data set and it needs to have an output. It needs to, whatever this LLM, like, that's not it. That's not enough. That just gets you, those are just the components. But if you don't understand how that can be applied across a number of different, even, certain tools there, I'm trying to think of what classes was. I think there was like a history of technology class, but one of the things was learning about these technology life cycles where a certain piece of tech will work and be mastered for a particular industry, and then somebody will come and innovate, not by completely reinventing something, but by taking that and applying it to a completely different industry that people weren't thinking about. And the more that you have folks who just, again, I just know how to build this thing, you're never going to have those super innovative, potentially societal changing shifts because all they know is, well, we built the pencil for, writing or whatever, right? It's like, that's
Mhm.
it. That's the only thing it could be used for, right? And yet there are other implications for what you can do with a writing utensil. And maybe, as I just thought that off the top of my head, pencil is maybe not the best example, but there are other tools that have more wide reaching implications. And again, for good and certainly for detriment to society, and being mindful of those, we need to be building systems that support those divergent folks instead of saying, no, 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 you're thinking too much about this problem. Just very, very quickly, the last thing that I'll say on this is it reminds me, even I was speaking at Drexel a few weeks ago, talking to them about creating spaces for neurodivergent folks in STEM and my experience there. And one of the things I brought up was What if in our hydrodynamics class, we didn't just learn about laminar flows and different things of that nature, but we started to also think about what does this mean for Flint
Hmm.
and other populations that are, having water crises, let's call them, right? And so how are we building things that address those societal level issues that again are leveraging engineering to solve them, but they're also adding this other component about,
Yeah.
the societal impacts.
Yeah, very,
So,
very consequential decisions. I mean, and like we think the only thing that we should pay attention to, or that's how the education is set up, is to make sure the accuracy of the calculations are there. So
hmm hmm
if I give your calculation to someone else, they're gonna kind of converge to the same answer that you converge to. So
hmm
that's
hmm
the
hmm
focus, right? I mean, like in our homework, in our exams, in the courses, in the way
hmm
we present material. And
hmm
what you said is very important, that kind of holistic thinking, that lateral thinking, essentially thinking more broadly about the problem. And that is not necessarily, I mean, I want to make it very clear. That's why I intentionally use neurodiversity rather than saying neurodivergence. Because when we talk
hmm
about neurodivergence, we're talking about one person again. And again, like we definitely need to support and make sure these people, non-traditional learners, those that they kind of don't fit the mold, square pegs essentially,
hmm
they make it
Right.
through. But at the end of the day, we have to also change our way of thinking about engineering jobs or any advanced, maybe field of science and engineering. That one person, we have to have the humility to admit that like one person may not be able to think about all of these aspects,
Yes.
to kind of
Yeah.
like go through all the kind of details of the calculation and everything is accurate, so he's the best coder in the world, I mean, like most efficient kind of like computer programmer, and at the same time thinks about societal implications. So that's why we need to have people that they have different mindsets, different way. For example, like someone with ADHD, I mean, like I've mentioned that before in the podcast, I personally love to contribute at early stages of ideation. But if you
hmm
ask me, okay, like now take this Excel sheet and like plug in numbers, and then you're not going to see me again. So
Yeah. Right.
but
I'm
there
with
are
you.
other people that are very comfortable doing that. And
Absolutely.
if you tell them to go and like come back with five ideas, that makes them nervous. I mean, that's not their
hmm
strength, but they can be the most
Absolutely.
accurate, meticulous, people to go through a tedious, process and make sure things are consistent, coherent, and
hmm
complete.
hmm
So we have to really think beyond this kind of individualistic perspective of education, that we have to train individuals in a way that one person can cover the entire spectrum. It's impossible.
Absolutely.
It's humanly impossible. And that's not how human brain has evolved. It's becoming like very expensive for in terms of caloric use and for the body to maintain. So it started diversifying at some point. There are theories around this thing. That
hmm
this neurodiversity is a specialization of our cognitive skills essentially, and then now it's called like disability or dysfunction. Just think about that. It's like a very, very interesting thing, that an asset, an intentional evolutionary design, we are so bold that we call it a disability.
Yeah. So, gosh, it reminds me of like a phrase that I'm starting to use, and non-traditional learner. I definitely, for me, it's almost synonymous, but I'm calling it uniquely brilliant minds, right? Because it is about this diversity of mind, right? And there are some folks, like you said, who they are really good in this one aspect. If you ask them to come over here and do it, that's going to be a challenge for them, and then vice versa. And so the more that we recognize this as ways in which folks are able to leverage the way that their mind experiences the world to bring their perspective and enhance the world and kind of carry the, I don't want to say carry the weight, right? But like that they are built to address that particular
Yeah,
way of doing things. Like the more that we see that, this is why I say like labels don't have to equal pathology
yeah,
as well, because it's not about things necessarily being broken. Yes, there are some things about people's experiences, and I hear people saying this all the time about that make things challenging, but at the same time there are ways in which our minds work that the real issue isn't the way that our minds work, but it's just the system that it's being put in.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we change the system, all of a sudden, Sheldon, who, when he was a little kid, would scare and sometimes irritate his mom by taking things apart
Yeah.
and looking at all the inner workings and putting it back together, instead of that being like concerned about quote unquote breaking something, all of a sudden now there's this space where it's like, oh, he's super curious about the inner workings of things.
Yeah.
And today I'm fixing things around the house that I've never worked with before, but just because I have taken the time to kind of dig into pulling
Build
things apart, if that makes
confidence.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's very informative. I want to just maybe take a minute or two to talk about your experience. You did MBA, right? I mean, you didn't go
Yes.
to traditional grad school, right? Why
Yes.
why did you choose to do MBA rather than getting a master's in
Yeah,
similar?
so I chose not to do a master's in engineering just because I realized towards the end of undergrad that as much as I love technology, as much as I love analytical thinking and problem solving, like I loved all of that. What I was much more focused on was leveraging technology to solve societal problems. So to do that best, I knew that I needed or I at least wanted a tech focused MBA
Mm-hmm.
because I wanted to understand, the business implications. And in fact, one of my favorite classes in grad school was a course called The Business Implications of Emerging Technologies. And it was so long ago that this was before actually the Teslas of the world were really popular. One of the projects that we worked on was looking at electric vehicles and the infrastructure that would be needed. So the charging system. So this is again before there was any kind of solution in place. And so, we were thinking about, okay, we've got this really cool tech, but now you need to either have the government build these stations or somebody private. Like, and how do you kind of work all those things together? There were a few classes like that that really solidified why I went to get my tech focused MBA at RPI. But there was basically essentially what it turns out to be is like a product management class,
Mm-hmm.
because you had to, in the class, you had to think about the marketing side. Is this technology that we're thinking about building something that people want? Then you had to think about the manufacturing part. Then you had to also think about the sales part. Okay, how are we going to actually sell this? And the design, I don't think I specifically mentioned the design part, right? How should it look? And so we had a project where we had to come up with a innovative like household product. And long and short, I came up with what I call the Lawnba. And so for those who are familiar with the Roomba,
Mm-hmm.
this is when the Roomba that was the only thing that was on the market. And so I was like, well, what if we built a Roomba for the lawn? Like, people hate cutting their grass, but we could build something that essentially did the same thing on the lawn. And people laughed at me. People were like, lawn, but haha, like pat on the head, nice thought, Sheldon. And I just say the coulda, woulda, shoulda, because now I see them, that people building these things, they're selling for thousands of dollars, right? I think it speaks to, again, a lot of the things that we've been talking about. One, how are we reinforcing people who are thinking like this? But also, once you reach a certain level, a lot of folks have been taught like this very traditional, like very sort of linear way of thinking is the way that we should be going. And this is who's made it through kind of the system, right? And so now, instead of people being like, wait a second, that might actually be a pretty good idea,
Yeah.
people are laughing. And like I said, we could have been making millions. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's another
You
example.
were meant to not go down that route, so you had to stay in and pay
Right. No,
forward. Yeah.
no, I'm perfectly fine
Yeah.
with my journey, but it's always one of those laughs that I have.
So what made you start your podcast? First, tell us what your podcast is about, what the intention of that is.
Yeah, so yeah, my podcast is called I Must Be Buggin', which the Buggin stands for, it's spelled BUGN, which stands for Black, Underrepresented, Unidentified, Gifted, and Otherwise Neurodivergent. And I started it because a little over a year ago, I realized that I was neurodivergent and that I was gifted. And so all these stories that I'm telling you about, where I realized, wait, my mind works differently. And that's why when
Mhm.
I'm in school, when I'm on the job, when I'm interacting with friends, that there's something different going on. So my podcast is really about speaking to the experience of what it means to not only be neurodivergent, not only be gifted, but be from the Black and underrepresented community's perspective, because that
Yeah.
adds another layer
Like what?
of.
Can you
Yeah. So I'll say that going back to when I was young, one of the challenges was being in a class where, I mean, frankly, white students could either misbehave or, just be non-traditional learners in general, right? They could either be celebrated or supported. So now all of a sudden, little Johnny is having trouble in class, and now we're trying to find tutors, or we're trying to find a way for that child to get medication, even whatever it is. For me, what I had were times when people sent me to the office. But I think about when we were preparing to learn algebra, they had us take this test. And essentially, the purpose of the test was to determine who would go to algebra, who would go to pre-algebra. I took the test and I left, and one of the teachers pulls me to the side and it says he wants to talk about the test. I'm thinking, dang, Sheldon, you did that bad on the test that the teacher's got to pull you to the side? Well, long and short, what ends up happening is that he tells me I did better on the test than some people who have already had algebra class, but they want me to not take algebra because they're concerned that I won't do well. And this is a familiar story for a lot of folks who come from marginalized communities, because instead of us being put into these more advanced classes, folks are doubting our abilities. Or again, if I'm showing up in class constantly asking questions that aren't necessarily aligned, all of a sudden I'm being disruptive, right? As opposed to just being curious. I've had multiple stories of knowing more than a teacher about a particular subject, and instead of that being an opportunity to say, wow, teach us some more, it's, oh, you think you're smarter than me, and now I'm going to give you problems, right? And I'm not saying that hyperbolically. I mean literally. There was a teacher when we were talking about learning what do lions eat, and I had said, oh yeah, they eat elephants as one example, and she's like, no, you don't, they don't do that, da 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 da. Well, come to find out, she looked it up. And I give her credit for the fact that she came back to me, right? But she gave me so much hard time in the meantime about what I knew and how I was trying to interject and advocate for myself, that later on, give her credit. She did kind of acknowledge it. Yeah, actually, I looked it up and you were right. And so, but imagine if these are the kinds of experiences that you're having all the time. For me, it's really important to speak to that and help people to see what that's like and kind of investigate that.
So you think one of the layers that are added to that intersectional experience is the prejudice that people may have?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that definitely is there. And in addition to some other cultural, I mean, like I've talked to some other guests from underrepresented communities. One issue that they grapple with is if they need support, if they need to go through any kind of formal process of evaluation, they're very hesitant to let the kid actually go through that process, because they're afraid that if there is another label on the kid, then how it's going to shape the future of the student. Can you speak to that if that resonates with you?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because there's multiple facets, but this is definitely one of the key things, is that even when you go home, and I talked about this in one of my episodes, and I'm trying to remember which one it was, but I talked about this in one of the episodes, right? And I'll just speak from the Black experience, right? So one of the challenges is, as Black folks, when we go out into the world, there's already multiple hurdles that we've got to jump through. I mean, some Black parents will name their child, quote unquote, white names, because they're afraid of what happens when they submit a resume and whether or not they'll get the job. And that's real, right? And that's something that's baked into our cultural experience from real life examples. And so now, when you're saying to yourself, okay, I know that my son, my daughter, my child will have to have all these kinds of things to carry with them, do I want to add another one? Because neurodiversity is something that there's not a lot of knowledge about it, period. A lot of people just misunderstand it, period. So do I want them to be misunderstood further?
And it is a stigmatized also.
I was just going to say, right. So when people hear the stigmas, right? So people hear ADHD or autism. Let me just speak to those really just quickly. which is a lot of people, their idea of what autism is extremely stigmatized. I can't tell you how many times I've met parents who will say my son, my daughter, my child has autism, but they're basically the good kind of autistic. Again, that speaks to me, no judgment necessarily of the parent, but it just speaks to the stigmas that are around it and the way in which folks don't feel comfortable moving freely and speaking about their child's experience without feeling like it's a burden to them. And so a lot of families, instead of going through those questions, kind of avoid it. So I know a lot of folks who say that their parent may have known when they were little, but they never told them. And because they were like, oh, as long as I don't tell them, right, they won't walk through life feeling like they're broken. I'm hoping that more and more parents find a way to navigate that in a different way, I'll say. Because, I mean, frankly, regardless of whether or not somebody gives you a label, your experience is still going to be your experience. You will still live with it. You won't check the box on a job application and potentially be discriminated against because of it. But once you're there, the issues may still arise. I think it's important for parents to be having this conversation because, as I'm sure some of the listeners will know, those who do go and bring their child in for diagnosis will then eventually realize that they share one or all of the same diagnoses as well. That can be a pretty shocking experience, to say the least. So the more that we just kind of create these safe and curious and non-judgmental environments for us to explore our minds, the better.
You,
So
you think
yeah.
is this one of the things that you intend to accomplish with your podcast and advocacy work to inform parents better so they're more open to having conversations around this? Again, like I'm not suggesting that like we have to start like going around and making sure everyone has a medical diagnosis or something like that.
Right,
I'm
right,
not
right.
advocating for something like that, but that at least dissolving that stigma is important. Is it something you will work on?
Absolutely. No, thank you for asking that. That's exactly my focus, is really on that group of unidentified folks. And because even if you never get a formal diagnosis, even if you never identify with a particular label, one of my biggest things in both my podcast and in my speaking work is to speak about the experience. The focus for me is on the experience and destigmatizing the experience. If you are
Yeah.
someone who has trouble kind of determining is something going to take 5 minutes or 20, I'm not going to tell you whether or not that's ADHD or not, or autism or whatever. Like, I'm not here to tell you that it has to be any one of those things. But what I want for you to know is that that is common. There are other people out there who have that same experience, and there are ways to actually address it. You don't just have to think about, gosh, I'll never be a productive employee, which again, a lot of this stuff comes back to these systems of oppression, right? But like, these just different systems that want us to be in these boxes where it's like, I have to feel bad because of my way in which I interact with time, as opposed to finding ways to, maybe set reminders, right?
Hmm.
Alarms for myself or whatever. Something that is, again, if it's that important, I can figure it out, but like not having to beat myself up about it. That's the core of my work, is to remove shame, to become curious about
Hmm.
the things that are happening with us, and to empower people to then advocate for, again, their needs around their experience without ever having to go to an employer. I don't think anyone should have to go to an employer and bring their medical history
Yeah.
folder. I think they should simply be able to say,
These are my needs. These
if
are my
the
strengths.
exactly right, these are my needs, these are my strengths, and then the environment should find some way to accommodate that. That's really my goal, is to help create a world that recognizes that as something that is truly valuable.
Yeah, that's definitely valuable. One thing I want to add to what you said is the recognition. I mean, like we can hide it, we cannot talk about it, we can just
Mhm.
like be aware of it, but like never have a conversation or acceptance of it in any form or be in denial. That
Mhm.
is one
Mhm.
approach, which again, like unfortunately, a lot of parents, understandably so. I understand why it is happening. Another thing that happens after we accept this, we recognize this, is we're more open to seek information. And when you go out and listen to, for example, like people that they talk about this on blogs, podcasts like yours, you will say, oh,
Mm-hmm.
this is not only me having these experiences. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
like, for me, the immediate impact of diagnosis was I stopped blaming myself,
Mm-hmm.
because by then I had always blamed myself for any challenge, any failure, for any problems that I had faced, any difficulties in work environment, in education.
Mm-hmm.
And after I kind of like educated myself a little bit on this, I realized that, oh, a lot of them are just the problem of the system. I mean, the system is
Mm-hmm.
dumb. I mean, like, it's not that we are dealing with a perfect system. It's just like we are experiencing these problems because we are ingesting a lot of toxins. So it's obvious that we are not feeling good. So if we
Mm-hmm.
can do something about that, and that's what we are trying to accomplish. I mean, like the work I'm doing, the research I'm doing, we have a long way to go. But in the meantime, we can raise awareness. I mean, I'm very happy that you are doing this work, and I wish you all success. It's very important having this conversation, culture relevant conversations. They're very important, and that they may have a profound impact, because you never know. I mean, like, you may just reach that parent or that kid at the right time, the time that they are
Mm-hmm.
making a critical decision, dropping out, changing major, and that can be a transformative experience right there.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, two things. One, when you talked about when you stop blaming yourself, I think blame is, my gosh, we don't, this is not the space to even talk about why that word is so personal. But I'll just say that I've known and been in contact with folks for whom blame has been so ingrained into them that they can't see beyond it. And it's sad because it's not about blame. There's no reason in all these different ways to blame ourselves. There's a difference between blame and accountability. If I said I was going to be somewhere, whatever, at 5 o'clock, and I don't show up at 5 o'clock, okay, there's an accountability around that. But there's no reason to blame yourself, right? You can, again, as you not shown up, you can have a conversation with the person about what happened and all that kind of stuff. And the next time, now you got alarms or whatever it is that kind of prevents you from doing that again. But you don't need to blame or punish yourself, right? I think that's where a lot of the work that we need to do needs to be focused on, because those aren't productive things for us to do. The other thing that I wanted to speak about is, as a tangent, a lot of that creates systems where we feel isolated. Now we're kind of cutting ourselves off from other people, and we feel so distanced from them. And that's at the core of my work too, is to
Mhm.
help people find community, because in particular, because since I have identified in this way, I've opened up a world of community that has really been instrumental in my life in the last year. And I've seen the power of, now, as you said before, right? Like, when you feel alone, it's a completely different world when you realize, oh, wait, there's a pocket of people over here who think like me, act like me, talk like me, laugh at the same kind of jokes as me, whatever it is, right? The human experience is so driven
Mhm.
by social interactions and
Yeah.
about feeling connected and feeling mirrored. And so opening yourself up to opportunities to experience that, that's the beauty of this work. In my lifetime, in either one of our lifetimes, all of the problems will probably not be solved, right?
Yeah.
But my goal is to create more awareness and more access to community,
Yeah.
and to let go of that shame.
How has the reception been so far?
It's been really good. And actually, I had a friend who I went to undergrad with, who, it's been a couple months now, but she reached out to me. She had like listened to an episode or seen some of my posts about what was going on. And she said, my son, I think he might be twice exceptional. And for those who don't know, that's a term that's typically used for folks who identify as gifted, but also have some other neurodivergence, whether it be ADHD, autism, dyslexia, whatever. Right. And so she talked about this experience of being like, he's so smart. And then in these ways, the teachers are saying that he's challenged and I don't know what to do, but I'm listening to you speak about this. And now I see him in a completely different way based upon what you were sharing. And now we can, like, she was asking me for some resources and all this different stuff. So like before she interacted with me, it was this awkward situation with the teachers where her son was being looked at in this way where it was a challenge, like a problem to be solved, as opposed to now, oh, wait a second. We just need to provide some accommodations over here, right? And, we just need to, again, not look at him as a problem to be solved and wondering why he's not, quote unquote, living up to his potential, which is super weighted for a lot of us, right? This quote unquote living up to potential. We can eliminate that entire frame of mind and say, again, how do we see him as a whole human being and support him where he's needed and then watch him thrive,
Yeah.
right? And then that's the real thing. So I've had a couple of folks reach out to me and share stories like that, people who've become curious about themselves and said, you know what, I might go and look into diagnosis, or
Nice.
I'm going to be speaking more publicly about my diagnosis because I feel like there's space to do that now. And so that's the
Yeah,
sauce.
I
That's the
understand.
goal
Yeah,
right there.
that's the goal
Yeah.
right there. And again, there are some of us that we think about those larger scale, impactful projects like foundation skills, things like that, or revolutionizing education, things like that. Again, that's valuable. There is value in that, but I think it's also important to not ignore the importance of touching single lives, individual experiences like that. First of all, it's extremely rewarding when we get a feedback like that, or I get emails from parents or even like individuals, even after graduation, that they've found something interesting in the podcast. And that's very rewarding when you think about that. It seems it's doing something, and every life matters, every person's well-being matters. So if we can do something with our time to make an earning, and at the same time we have some positive impact, like moving the needle in the right direction a little bit, I think that's it. I mean, we don't need to
That's
really kind of like do much in the life.
You remind me of one of my life mantras. So I think about my grandparents. My grandparents never, were millionaires, right? They may have never even seen $500,000 in their lifetime. But I think about both of their funerals, and their names were Lucius and Eunice Hollinger. But both of them had so many people from the community come out and share stories that some of us hadn't even heard. I remember the people talking about when my grandfather was working at a local supermarket around here, and how he made sure that certain families in the neighborhood who didn't have money like ate. Well, like, look, we'll figure it out, and whether he paid out of his own pocket or whatever it was, right, to just make sure that those families had. I mean, again, I could share a million different stories, but the short thing that I would say is that it's made me think about this life goal of making sure that the line of people who come to tell stories about what Sheldon meant to them is longer than my resume.
Nice.
Again,
That's a cool
I'm
thing.
going to do, I'm going to do some cool stuff, and that's fine. But what's more important is that somebody, when I do transition, that says, you know what, Sheldon meant something to me. And to me, that's a greater legacy, right?
Awesome.
So that's kind of how I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that. That's how I'm approaching my life.
Beautiful way to look at life, honestly. That's beautiful. Sheldon, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I typically end the podcast by asking my guests what would be their advice to 14, 15-year-old self of themselves when they look back. What would be what you needed to know or wished you knew, at that age?
Man, without without shedding any tears, because that's a deep question, one that I'm revisiting on a whole lot of levels, like I said now. But I would say to my younger self to love yourself more, to accept yourself. You're doing all right. You're doing well, even. And where it seems like the world doesn't get you, that it'll never understand or accept you, don't stress about that, because the most important thing is for you to love and accept yourself, and watch as that serves as a light to the people that are most important to find you.
Awesome.
That's what I would tell my younger self.
How about college age?
My college age Sheldon, I would say lean into that confidence, try all the new things, and trust that regardless of what happens, you will be able to thrive even if you make mistakes.
It's very valuable. Again, thank you again, Sheldon. It was a pleasure. I hope we stay in touch, and would be more than happy to do what I can to support you in your endeavor. That's very important, and I'm sure you will be successful. You're not going to need me, but again, if I can play a small role, I'm there for you.
Well, thank you so much, Raj. Again, this has been a pleasure. This is the Square Pegs, and just like I said, this connection we have has been special, and so I'm grateful for this opportunity and look forward to staying connected and potentially doing some more stuff together in the future.
Sure, look forward to that. Thank you for listening to Square Pegs. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Our podcast aims to raise awareness around neurodiversity, advocating for inclusive educational methods, and enhancing belonging for all students. We would love to hear your feedback. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share your biggest takeaways from this episode. Your reviews and feedback helps us improve. You can also leave us a message at squarepegspodcast.com, and we might feature it on the show. Thank you for being a part of the Square Pegs community.